And yeah, I guess it was maybe 2.5, 3 years ago that we met at the Rivers when the Rivers still existed, and got to talk about some different Africa work there. But let me share a screen here. Somebody give me the thumbs up once that shows.
It's showing the turning rainwater into opportunity. Yep.
All right, perfect. So as John mentioned, I kept the Forest Service thing on there because a lot of people don't know this, but the Forest Service actually has an international program, and it's based out of Washington, D.C. And I would say that largely what they do is support the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, when they're working in developing countries. When USAID has a natural resource thing, whether it be water or grazing, climate change, whatever, they'll actually dip back into the Forest Service for technical expertise. And I've had the good fortune to do that in a number of countries. But this one in particular in Congo was a little bit mind-blowing for me, just at the scale of what's going on. And then, honestly, when I left there, that at some point you get the idea that typical governmental intervention at quite a large scale that ends with a presentation and some points to move forward, kind of big scale stuff. It's just not going to do anything. And that was really one of these cases. So I couldn't quite leave it alone. So I ended up creating a nonprofit to be able to work at a scale that I thought was meaningful, which is ultimately at the community scale that I'll talk about a little bit more here. But to get at that, to me, it's an exploration of water, and I've spent my whole career with water, so I have that, I guess you could say, an intimate relationship with it. And to me, it's fascinating to think about something so very precious as water, that it's the most important thing in the world to you at one moment, and then the next moment there can be so much of it that it's literally trash. We try to get rid of it as fast as we can. And that dichotomy is really important when you start moving into these countries, especially in Central Africa, that operate off of a monsoon type climate where it really is too much or too little water, one after the other. And within this discussion, climate change is central to it. There's no denying what's going on and what these people are experiencing over there. And to me, central to climate change is water. Because I admit I have a narrow view here, but climate change, at least to me, speaks through the language of water. That's how we see what's happening with too much, too little, all those sorts of things. So to me, it's important to keep that context in mind, because for these people and so many people around the whole globe, that giving someone even a small amount of control over their own water supply ultimately can be a very big deal down the road. And water supply, who gets it? Where does it come from? We've all seen images like this, particularly in Africa, where it's typically young girls that have to go get water. Culturally, that's assigned to them. So it may take them out of school, it may take them away from other opportunities, puts them at risk depending on where they are. That's in that typical rural setting that we're familiar with. What we often don't see is what that looks like in an urban setting. And when you get into these very large cities in Africa, it's not common to have a water supply in your house. It's at a well or some other location where you have to go get it. So you see these lines of people with those 25-liter jerry cans waiting to fill it. Fill them up with a hose and you haul them home. And that literally is your water for washing your clothes, washing your body, preparing your food, drinking, everything. And for me, I have to keep reminding myself of that, because it's so easy to turn on the valve at home and just completely forget the relationship that so many people on the planet do or do not have with water. And there's a cost for this, obviously a cost in time, You have to pay for the water. You have to transport that water. You're missing out on other opportunities. So it's ultimately a big deal and can be a big part of your day. And then over the length of a thunderstorm, it goes from something so precious that you're paying for it and spending hours a day to get, that it's everywhere. And it's dangerous at some point. It's flooding your house, it's flooding your business. There's so much of it that you don't know what to do with, and you just wish more than anything for it to go away. And that really can be the case across this big swath of the globe that is driven by a monsoon climate, all the way through Central Africa, India, Southeast Asia, all those places that at some point depend on a relatively predictable monsoon season. And that predictability is going away with climate change. And the wet seasons are getting wetter and the dry seasons drier. So you get these more contracted periods with more precipitation that you just don't know what to do with, and they become hazardous at some point. And so I was fortunate enough to get invited through the US Embassy to look at an erosion issue in Congo. And so that's where it is, in that central equatorial belt of Africa. And I was in Brazzaville, which is in the Republic of Congo, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Kinshasa. And those are two really big cities, literally right across the Congo River from one another. But like I said, this is not a rural discussion. This is urban. So those big cities, Brazzaville's 3.5 million people, Kinshasa's about 14 million people. So you're talking about a New York City-sized group of people here. And there's a couple really important things that go on with that urbanization. One, like I mentioned, is climate change, but the other is rapid urbanization. And what's happening there is people are coming from the countryside, they're coming from other countries because of war or some kind of upset. And these cities are growing around the edges at a big rate, big to the extent that I think the United Nations predicts that in 30 years, 70% of the entire world's population will live in cities. The whole urban thing, rural thing, I mean, rural is going away, or it's just changing rapidly. But the important thing is that urbanization and the climate change, those are additive when it comes to water. And what happens with all that water that's falling from the sky when a landscape goes like this, part house, part farm, and over the course of 7 years, it does that. And I'll show you that one more time. This is 6 or 7 years showing kind of the development that goes on in these countries. And what's important here is that all these little houses that pop up, none of them have running water. They've likely got a pit toilet. So they're going somewhere to fetch their water. But as important, every single one of them has a corrugated metal roof. And that will show up as important in a bit. But there's a contrast to be made here, that when you're in the countryside, in this urban or in the savanna landscape, you just don't see water running off the ground when it rains. It's deep, deep sandy soils, it's vegetated. You can dump as much water as you can imagine, and a huge amount falls from the sky and it goes straight into the ground. And that changes night and day when you get this development over the top of it. And this is just a typical city block in Kinshasa that might be 250 yards by 200 yards long. So it looks like any big city rural development or urban development. It's roofs, it's roads, everything that goes with it. And for context, you get a 1-inch rainstorm, which for us is a lot, for them it's nothing. They get 1-inch rainfalls all the time. That's 1 million liters of water. They deal with liters over there, but 250,000 gallons of water that comes down over the course of an hour. And it has to go somewhere. It's not going into the ground anymore. And there's literally water everywhere running off of these roofs and roads. And as you know, water just doesn't stand still. It's going somewhere, and it's going to the nearest river or some outlet to the sea. And that's the essence of this whole urban runoff thing, is the amount of water that can no longer infiltrate into the ground has to go somewhere. And the roads end up being slightly lower out there because most of them are not paved. So with use, they get a little bit lower than the surrounding ground, So they essentially become rivers. You can see what happens here when it rains a lot. Those are roads that look tremendously like a river. And what that means is in the low areas, you get flooding, and up on the higher ground, you get erosion like we can't even comprehend. And so what you're looking at there is that it's a concrete drain that used to run alongside of a road. In the bottom next to the piece that fell off is a car body. So that's the scale that you're talking about. 75, 100-foot deep holes in the ground because of these sandy soils and the amount of water that's been introduced to them. And it's heartbreaking for some of these people because everything they got is gone. And one thing I can tell you, there is no Allstate that's going to write these people a check to rebuild their house. They didn't cause what happened. They're not going to get help in fixing. They're just simply grabbing what they can and leaving. And if it were only a few homes, you could say, all right, it's part of urbanization. But in reality, the roads are going, the utilities are going, the power's going. I've seen some of these where the power lines are literally dangling in the air because there's no ground below to support them. And there's a funny little byproduct that comes with this, is that quite ingenious actually, but they found that if you dump garbage in these holes in the head of that head cut, it stops it from moving. The only problem is that interface between the ground and that gully is the connection to groundwater, which is their primary drinking water supply. So you're essentially dumping domestic garbage into the interface between your fresh water and your groundwater. And that really is an existential threat to these giant cities, because once groundwater is polluted, you don't go backward on that, at least not in a time frame that is meaningful to us or within a financial budget that these people might have access to. And kind of a twisted aside here, as I put that $100 on that garbage truck, this sounds rather mafia-like, but now it's come about where these garbage companies actually charge the communities $100 to dump the collected garbage in the hole. So they've swung that around to make a bit of a racket out of it, actually. So that aside, this gives you a scale of some of these holes that happen. And at this spot, this was transformative for me, because I was standing on the right side of this photo over by one of those houses, looking down in there and I was by myself at that point, and an older man came out of one of those houses and he saw me standing there. And you can imagine that someone that looks like me does not blend in Congo. And there's been an issue in these neighborhoods that they're really up in arms because they don't feel like the government is doing anything to help with the situation. But this guy saw me and immediately knew that at least something was going on. And he said to me the words that kind of changed how I looked at it. He said, "Oh, now we have hope." And I thought, oh no, that is way too much pressure. Can't live up to that. But we had a pleasant exchange and we're done with that. But it really did make me think that there really is no hope for him. And I would bet now that a couple of years later, his house is gone because it was too close to the edge of that. By the time it adjusted, it would take it away. But there really is a lot of hope here for preventing this kind of thing and all the ills that goes with it. And to me, the best part about it was it's not relying on a big government solution that honestly, it's never going to come. What it relies on is this distributed solution where everybody's house, everybody's ground around their house actually matters. And there are ways to look at that bring in other benefits and kind of solve an erosion issue through the back door through actually providing a water supply. And so I've come to look at this as that there's a very clear decision point here that actually happens at the edge of that roof. And the edge of that roof, what happens there depends on whether this water is a liability or is an amazing asset that everybody has to have anyway. And the thing that makes that transformation is something as simple as storage. It's just our reservoir concept. We don't use all our spring runoff. at the time it's running off, we store it to use later. And that's exactly what is happening or can happen there. These are just examples of big plastic tanks that you can buy to store water in. But moving into the idea of outcomes here and desired outcomes, we're really pushing this idea of runoff neutral, meaning you are in charge of a piece of property that is yours. How can you make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to affect your downstream neighbor? And at the same time, kind of experience the benefits that come with a water supply that's quite literally being delivered to your house every time it rains. And there's a combination there of storage and use of water, some green space, some encouraging infiltration, all those pieces that go with it. And I threw these sustainable development goals up there because these are big deals in the international world to be able to talk about clean water and sanitation, sustainable communities, climate action, and sort of things that the rest of the world looks for these sustainable development goals in Hellier meetings. So those will pop up. Not necessarily a big deal for what we're talking about. But when we're talking about collecting rainwater, there are templates out there. This house, I was thinking about it earlier today, this would be the equivalent of a house at, let's say, Aspen Glen, or maybe River Valley Ranch. This is a really nice house, and you can tell by the roof. That type of a metal roof with a system that's built with, to hold a gutter is really unique, and it's wealthy people that have it. And on the right there, it's a 15,000 gallon underground tank. So from that roof, these people collect enough water to last them the entire year. 99.9% of the population can't do that there, but the idea is that's out there and people are doing it. What you're more likely to see is something like this, where you grab a piece of corrugated metal, you bend it over, you wrap it up with wires, the equivalent of duct tape, whatever it may be, and try to route that into a container. At the very least, you'll see people trying to hook something at least over their door so they can walk in and outside of their houses without getting drenched when it's raining. But what we saw was that the only thing that keeps you, from doing this very simply is it's very difficult to attach a gutter to this corrugated metal lip without a fascia board or the construction materials that we typically have. So we thought, well, why don't we just come up with something? We could make it out of thermoplastic that will just simply slide on the edge of the corrugated metal roof and be able to hold a gutter. Because you can buy gutters along the street, gutter sections. You just don't have a way to hook them on there. And so they simply slide on a roof like that at some regular interval of a couple, 3 feet. You can set a gutter in it, and before long, you've caught the water coming off the roof, and you can put it to use if you have a way to store it. And admittedly, those big plastic tanks, those are perfect to just grab, set in place, and you're done. One, they're quite expensive. And two, they're just not that easy to move around in these places that don't have big wide roads to them. They're basically footpaths. So we introduced the idea, it's an old idea, but the idea of ferro cement, which is essentially a chicken wire frame, and you're making a cement sand mortar, and basically it's almost like putting on stucco. So anybody with 10 minutes of training can start building a ferro cement tank. So that's what we're doing out there, is introducing this kind of low-tech technology. And what's fascinating is, the women do most of the work there, and they start putting this stuff on, and they're like, oh yeah, we know how to do this. This is how we built our houses back in the village. And they're houses, kind of stick houses, and they're using a clay mud to do it, but it's the exact same thing, and they pick it up in a heartbeat. And before you know it, they're building a tank that is comparable size to what you would buy for maybe 40% the cost, that engages the community in what they're doing. And before long, you've got your own water system. But there's some hurdles that go with this. We're talking about changing social norms, which is never easy. And what are the incentives to change? What's the incentive for this woman to spend money that she barely has access to collect water? And certainly it's not going to be to protect your downstream neighbor in most cases. It has to be a little more this sounds wrong, but kind of self-serving. You have to get some benefit out of that. And you can see she's already dumped a bunch of concrete on the ground here to keep her house from eroding away. But there are some big perks to doing this, and the biggest one being a domestic water supply. And this is an example of a tank that we helped build with the community. It flows into an overflow, call it a losing well, to infiltrate the rest of it to make sure that they are in that runoff neutral situation. These people mostly came from the villages. They were farmers. They would love to grow some food for themselves or to sell, but they don't have any water. So this allows them to do that, to have that source. It gives the opportunity for the women to actually be engaged in the economy as well, because there aren't a lot of avenues within that culture for them to do it. Food and food production is one of them. Small business opportunities abound, with whether it's installation, maintenance of the gutters, the clips, the storage tanks. You'll see places again that sell gutters like this without a way to connect it. Give them some clips, they'll sell more gutters because they can get, almost anyone can install those. Green space infiltration, the churches do a great job of this, being leaders about how to contain their water, creating green space that, honestly, this is a nice spot to hang out when you're in Kinshasa compared to bare eroding ground. And then finally, the approach of protecting your downstream neighbor, because the poorest of the poor end up living in the low areas. And so when it floods from all this water, they're the ones that are impacted. So again, I think there's a lot of incentive to change, but what we find is that you just can't tell people about that. You have to demonstrate that to them. So that really kind of feeds into where we're going in the next year. We've got these 3 priorities, and one of them is to continue with these demonstration projects, because we really do believe, and we've seen it, that seeing is believing. And these projects that we've implemented, they get a lot of attention, and a lot of people come around to see how they do it, or to see how we can be involved to help them do that, to kind of start spreading that, call it a social contagion, of getting this idea to spread so it eventually just takes over. The goal being that when someone builds a house, a water collection system is just simply part of a roof. It's as essential as the roofing itself. And so that's one of our priorities, obviously, is to continue with our demonstration projects. Another one is to develop the roof clip that we started. We've got some modifications. We get feedback all the time from our in-country partners. So, well, how about this? How can we make it so we can get more slope on the gutter? Can we turn it and use it with a fascia board? All these different things where we're constantly tweaking the design of that eventually we want to put that into an injection mold. So it's costs 50 cents to make that. Because right now we're 3D printing them and taking them over, and that's expensive. But it's just how you have to do prototyping now, because it's just way too expensive to pay for an injection mold that isn't what you actually want. And then the third thing that we're focusing on is with our in-country partners, helping them with a couple positions for salary support to expand their capabilities, so we can have the reach that we would like to actually reach in the next year. So that's all I have to say. This is a typical scenario for most people, probably 3 or 4 times a week, waiting your turn to go inside and fill up some buckets and carry it home. So that's what we're addressing. So I will end it there.
So Mark,
you
mentioned in-country partners. Are any of those Rotary clubs?
No, they're not.
Because I just went, while you were talking, I went online. There are about 11 Rotary clubs in Kinshasa. And the best way to maximize Rotary dollars is with an international project and matching grants. So the way that works is, let's say our district or our club partners up with a club over there. We each chip in money, and then the district matches that money. And then Rotary International matches the district money. So you build this pile of cash. And I'm just, that's the best way to leverage the most funds from Rotary. I mean, we could give you money, but if we did it through that process, which takes some time, but and there's a lot of accountability that needs to go on with that, and reports, et cetera, so that it's a sustainable project. But I'm just it might be interesting to contact Rotary clubs in Kinshasa and see if we might be able to get that kind of ball rolling.
Yeah, and I think it was Michelle might have asked when we met last week about Rotary clubs in Kinshasa, and I obviously didn't know any, and I hadn't looked, but it's kind of funny because I would have bet. It's like, boy, I don't know, I wouldn't expect one to be there. So that's actually good news.
There's like 11.
There's 11 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, if you go to rotary.org and you search through and you say, look for Club Finder, and then you just put in Kinshasa, and it'll list where they meet, when they meet. Most of them meet at restaurants throughout the city area. And I'm just saying, if you have in-city, in-country partners that are involved in this, that they may be able to do some of that footwork for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Peter Jofnick and I chatted about that, and there's Melanie knows you have to find, there's a zone person who takes care of an area in wherever in Africa, I guess. Anyway, well, you go to him and he finds out, he tells you who to work with. And that's how you kind of start the game. Is that what you found?
Yes, and you know, I found that the club down there didn't necessarily have a bunch of money to contribute, but the way the international grants are set up, they will do a lot of the bookkeeping and the writing reports and kind of keeping, you know, they'll have the money in the end that comes from the international grant. And so, you know, they have some challenges with that because a lot of the people don't have good internet or whatever, but you know, you have to have a partner on the ground Rotary Club that's going to help you.
Another idea is, since many of those African countries were colonialized, that former colonial powers, Rotary clubs, are quite willing to help in those former colony countries. For example, I've been working a lot with Namibia, and German clubs are very eager to participate in projects like this. And of course, with the Congo, Democratic Republic was Belgian. So I would, if this project takes off, I would certainly contact some of the Belgian clubs as well and see if they're interested in participating.
Yeah, great idea.
One thing I was going to mention, Mark, and then I saw Heather had her hand up to ask a question. I don't know, you hadn't mentioned, but we certainly talked about it when you and I and Ken had gotten together. I was very impressed. You have a board there in, I think, Kinshasa, right? And
Kinshasa, yeah.
Yep, Kinshasa, 4 members there, and then you have a board here. So the good thing is you already have some people on the ground there that very likely could get involved in one of the Rotary clubs. I mean, I think that you're much further along than a lot of other international projects would be at this stage. So, and we can talk further. So don't feel like you have to do a lot of this. We'll talk about it with you. So you're not alone. You're not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Heather had a question.
Thanks, Michelle. Great presentation, Mark. I had a question about unintended consequences of doing something like this. And have you thought about that? Do those, and I don't know what that is, but you know, if we eliminate those water collection responsibilities for some people, what do they go to, or are there jobs that get displaced, or just curious, because I think sometimes we don't think about that and those bite us in the end.
Yeah, that's Heather, that's a great point. And I guess the way I typically think about that, and the way that we've entered into this, is that I recognize my role, or our role over here. And you know, there's really kind of 3 things that we can do. We can write checks, we can reallocate resources, and we can distribute power that may be somehow ascribed to us. And so I fully recognize that as a white guy in Carbondale, Colorado, there's not much I'm going to do there on my own that's meaningful, but I can sure as hell support the groups that I work with there who are part of those communities and know all about those consequences and kind of drive where we go and how we go there. And so I guess my answer to that is I kind of step out of the driver's seat there because I don't feel it's mine to drive and figure out how I can help support those people within their own communities come up with whatever solution it is. And this is where we've arrived so far.
You know, I'm a part of a community organizing group here in the Valley, and one of the things that's so prominent is that don't do for others what they can do themselves. And that's one of the guiding principles. And I think that's so beautiful. And what your project is that it's really around for the people, by the people who, for whom it will bring the benefit. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And an important point there that I'll just kind of spread out a little bit is that, you know, with all the people that we've been working with and that I've worked with in international development through the Forest Service and through this nonprofit is, you know, the thing that they will tell you is that altruism falls flat at some point for the reason you said, you know, don't do something for someone that they can do for themselves. Because what I found, and this is especially true in Asia where I've worked, is that anything that's given away tends not to be cared for. And so all the advice that we've got is basically, you know, do the demonstration, do the work to get movement on these social norms and the way people think, but eventually get this into the free market economy. Work your way back up with the roof suppliers, with the gutter suppliers, get clips, get those things out there, get these package systems in place that people can say, yes, I want one of those, and someone is there to build it, supply it, maintain it, and so on. So it becomes part of the whole economic structure, as opposed to something that a nonprofit or a government is trying to push one by one.
That's powerful insight and the voice of experience. Thank you. I think Rotary would be really, I think Rotary would be really find that a kind of attractive model.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Heather. I thought of the same thing when I met Mark and looked at what you were creating. He just started this in 2018. I'll toot your horn for you, Mark. That's pretty phenomenal. I mean, 2018 and here you are, but I think your mindset really does align with the projects that Rotary helps with and how we think about it. Other questions? We have maybe taken one or two. Hunter.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. Really fascinating and good work. One thing that strikes me is just the sheer volume of water that's causing the erosion problem. Have you looked into like the scale of implementation that would end up having a meaningful dent on that volume of water? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And when you look at the amount of impervious surface out there, you know, it's equivalent to any big city. It might be 75, 80, 85% plus. And we can get away with that here because we have billions of dollars of infrastructure that puts water into the ground, into a pipe, and dumps it in the Roaring Fork River, for example. There, it's a different story. So you're spot on there. How many roofs do you have to treat ultimately to get at that? And it's not a simple question, but we basically are looking at these very small drainage areas that would feed to these slight depressions in the ground that would be the head of a gully, and are just beginning to work with those going backward. But the honest answer to your question is, I don't think we can say with a straight face that we're solving the erosion problem straight up. We're solving a water supply issue that has a corollary benefit of addressing erosion. And then with each one of these water storage tanks that we put in, when they overflow, they go to a losing well. And then then for the whole parcel, it's got a dip in the ground, a low spot like a pond, where all the runoff that overflows from that ponds up and then infiltrates. So we're basically hit it at one compound at a time, but I'm hesitant to say we're going to solve it.
Yeah, well, that's an honest answer. Thank you.
Jim, did you have a question? Jim Drollet? Okay, okay. I don't know if yeah.
No, I got a question.
John and then Deb, and then I think that'll bring us, we're right running at 1:30. Yeah, John, go ahead.
First thing is I want to tell Mark, thank you very much for coming to share this with us. It's probably given us a little insight into a project that we can get involved with, but where do we go from here? That's the question I'm asking. And
Who are you asking that to?
Probably Michelle, Ken,
Oh, okay.
hey, Peter.
So in answer to your question, I think Ken and I are diligently going to do some work on what a grant looks like. Peter, thank you. Mark, you don't know this, but Ken shared with Peter Yashofnik with the headphones on. He writes our district newsletter. He took information from your website, Mark, put it out there in our district newsletter, which covers a vast area of Colorado down to the Colorado Springs area, to see if there are other clubs that could possibly be interested in joining in on this endeavor. Peter, you brought up some other, I mean, it isn't just our district that might want to get involved. We'll look at that and also do our due diligence with the grant writing process. And then of course, get together with you and talk about how do we create this so we don't become one of those government entities that just hand something over. How do we create a relationship with the people in Congo and in these two urban cities to create success? So this is one of many conversations that I think are yet to come. And I just want to get to Deb's question before we bring our meeting to a close. Deb.
No question, really. Just thank you, Mark, for what you're doing. I think part of what we are as Rotary is to just encourage and, pat on the back, right, for folks like you who step out and really see something and make it happen, and then figure out how can we even more substantially help you. So yeah, thoroughly impressed. And I think we have some real opportunity here and some amazing people just right here on the screen who can really do some work with you. Thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. I will say, to kind of wrap this up, that I have gone, my career in engineering, kind of doing my thing, and I'm not that great at, and I don't enjoy asking for help. And so when John brought this up and Michelle kind of brought it forward to find people who are willing to engage with this, it's a wonderful feeling. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it does take